again, and welcome to our Virtual Events 101 webinar, How to Grow, Retain, and Engage Your Membership. I'm your MC and moderator, Ari Hartung, Director of Operations here at Stansfeld. We're excited to get started and look forward to a fun and engaging presentation. But first, a few housekeeping items. As I stated, we want this to be a lively and engaging discussion, so please ask questions throughout. To do so, in the control panel, you'll find a raised hand icon with an open field text box to ask your questions. Questions will be kept anonymous, so please feel free to ask anything related to the topic, of course. We will get through as many questions as we can in the last 10 minutes. As a follow-up, we will send you an email with a video recording for your records. We'll also publish a blog post with the answers to the questions asked during the webinar. Lastly, if we don't cover something or you think of a question after the fact, please feel free to send us an email at info@stansfeldllc.com. With that out of the way, let's get started. Your presenters for today are Grace Gittner and Reina Caraveo. Grace is a digital event strategy and event marketing consultant. She has over 15 years of experience with events and marketing spanning agencies, tech companies, and nonprofits. Reina is our senior events manager here at Stansfeld. As such, she is responsible for all of our in-person and virtual events, including state and national conferences, local chapter events, and webinars just like these. So now I'll go ahead and hand it over to Grace and Reina to take it from here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ari. We are very excited to be presenting Virtual Events 101 webinar for you today. And I just would like to quickly review the agenda of the different topics that we will be discussing today. Firstly, to get you familiar with some of the terminology surrounding virtual events, we are going to discuss different virtual event formats. We will also review event team and roles related to virtual events, planning timeline and content strategy, budgeting for a virtual event, how to attract and engage attendees, and also provide you with additional resources toward the end of the presentation for you to reference. As Ari mentioned, we will have 10 minutes at the end of this presentation for questions. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Grace to discuss the different virtual event formats.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here. Thank you, Stansfeld, for having me. I know this is going to be a really good conversation. So yeah, to kick us off, there are different types of virtual event formats. And lots of people have been using webinars. It's one of the oldest marketing tactics in the books. But lots of people nowadays also refer to webinars as virtual events. Totally up to you if you decide to put that as part of your definition for your organization. But we do want to be sure that when we're talking about webinars versus a longer virtual conference or full day virtual event, that we know what the differences are. Webinars, again, oldest marketing tactic in the book, or one of the oldest ones, are typically 1 hour. Traditionally, they are one person speaking, broadcasting out to an audience. Typically, there's very few engagement tactics, although I think that trend is changing. And typically, you're just talking about one topic since you just have that 45 minutes or an hour. But versus a virtual conference, which most people, have kind of turned to in this past year, are a full day, so multiple hours or multiple days even. You might do a few hours across, multiple days. You will have multiple speakers, multiple ways to engage, polls, quizzes, networking, entertainment, all kinds of good stuff like that. Anything that you might see, or almost anything you might see in a physical conference, if those elements are the virtual components are taken into a virtual conference, then that's when you get into what I think Rain and I would agree is a more traditional virtual event when we use that term. And there's, of course, some combinations of formats in between, which we'll get into throughout this conversation. Raina, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so basically, just like as Grace mentioned, webinars are your shorter format, quick topical discussion type of virtual events, and then conferences is essentially everything else. So there's a lot of terminology there with online event, digital event, virtual events that we kind of hear get thrown around, but really when it comes down to it, it's the content, and that we're going to talk about that in a minute, content strategy and planning timeline. But your longer format, multi-day structures of virtual events are going to be kind of falling into that conference category. And with that, of course, comes the planning side and identifying your event team. So just quickly going over this, there are several roles, but I want to make an important note that this isn't necessarily each individual person that you need to have for an event planning team. But you do need to ensure that these different roles are filled to be able to execute a successful event. So the primary one is going to be the person who's overseeing event management. So that's an event manager. Sometimes you'll hear program director. Sometimes you'll hear event director. The person overseeing the entire planning and technical process and kind of supervising the rest of the team is filling that event management role. They also help develop the overall run of show, which a run of show, if you're not familiar with that term, is the full agenda planning timeline breakdown with all the technical and logistical pieces involved with that. And they'll also be the person who is ensuring that the planning timeline is staying on track, that you're meeting deadlines. So that is a obviously very important role, kind of in the hierarchy of the structure of your planning team. Grace, did you want to add anything to that?
Nope.
Okay. So content management and speaker management is obviously another very important role because this is the structure of your event, the content, the meat of your event, right? So this person is helping most of the time to help curate the content for the virtual event. We're also working with the speakers because your presenters are providing a lot of that content. So they will help book speakers, coach them on best practices for a virtual format. I know in some cases, if someone has a lot of experience presenting in a physical live event or past conferences may not necessarily have experience presenting in a virtual format. So coaching them on what the best practices are in that kind of situation and speaking, and also working with them if you're doing pre-recorded presentations, which a lot of times can be convenient for virtual events. So you have that capability to edit, and you also have that scheduling coordination a little easier, and there's not as much pressure on the presenter to be speaking live. So the person overseeing the content and speaker management also is going to be very pivotal in completing these tasks. And marketing coordination, this will be the person actually who is developing your event website. So your landing page, registration pages, all the email campaigns and graphics that go along with marketing your event, promoting it on social media, creating the graphics for that, the copy, the posts. Obviously, with promoting an event, you want to get people to your event. So the marketing coordination is a huge piece as well. All of these, I would say, are equally important, and there's a lot that goes into them. So this is just, the main bullet points that we wanted to cover to give you a general overview with the specific roles related to each kind of planning task when it comes to the virtual event. And sponsorship coordination as well. So sponsorship coordination, this will be the person who is helping you develop the contact list if you don't have them already, or at least helping to pull them together from different areas you might have and develop a full sponsorship list, potential sponsorship list for you and for your event, building out that package with the benefits associated and what they can get on a virtual platform for virtual events, and cultivating and coordinating ongoing sponsorship. So sponsorship coordination, I know sometimes most people think it's pre-event and during event, but there's a lot of post-event work that also goes along with that, providing data to sponsors from the event and things like that. Grace, is there anything you'd like to add on these roles?
No, I think it's great.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Grace. We have a couple more roles that we want to cover on this next slide here.
One thing I'll note, thanks, Raina, is that I think a lot of times when people are starting out planning virtual events, if you don't have a couple under your belt or one under your belt yet, they take a lot more people than you might expect. A lot of folks, especially your stakeholders, might be asking you all to plan virtual events, and they're like, should be really quick, shouldn't take that long, that sort of messaging. And I think it's just important, and hopefully this webinar enables you to kind of come back and talk about how much work actually does go into digital events, virtual events. Even a simple webinar has multiple components and players involved. So hopefully these 2 slides are some ammunition you can take back to explain to your stakeholders why virtual events take so much time. They take almost as much time, especially if you're doing a multi-day conference, as a physical event would. And so as we're talking about these roles, think about any role you had at an in-person event, they probably have a spot in your virtual run of show. So that being said, I'll continue on in our categories here. So technical production management. This is so important. I mean, the internet, the technology, it just goes without saying that this is your venue. So, if something goes wrong here, if your internet goes down or someone didn't check the bandwidth or, something visually, whatever is broadcasting your content goes down or has a glitch, if your virtual event platform gets overloaded because there wasn't a good plan in place for the number of people you needed on your virtual event platform and it got overloaded. So all of those things, if those go down, you have no event. It's like if when you're planning the physical event and your venue, there's a fire drill, the fire alarm goes off and everybody has to evacuate. You have no event. So that's why this piece is so important. And unless you feel like you have a strong technical person on your internal team, this is something I would absolutely say is worth budgeting in and sourcing out. With that, having an MC and host is really important. You have these for your physical events. Sometimes that's your CEO, sometimes you hire a professional. For virtual events, you need someone guiding people along the journey of your virtual event. And even for this webinar, we've got someone introing us. We've got someone who's going to help facilitate live Q&A at the end. It's a nice touch, but for a longer event, you definitely want someone coming in, introing the morning, setting expectations for your audience, and then continuously threading not only the messaging, but continuing to set expectations for people throughout the virtual event, especially if your audience is a little bit newer to virtual events. And even if they aren't new to virtual events, every virtual event I've attended has been so different. So you want to set expectations for yours. Moderator. So this is can also maybe be called like a community manager or something like that, but this is somebody on the back end there's a chat box typically in virtual events. At least I encourage you to have one, some type of Q&A module. And then aside from that, you could be getting emails. Actually, you probably will get emails as well. You could potentially get phone calls if you've listed a phone number somewhere. There are lots of support staff you'll need on the back end helping answer those people's questions because your MC is busy, your speakers are busy, and then you've got other people managing other vendors. So just like you'd have an info desk at your in-person event, we would encourage you to have a virtual info desk, so to speak, with somebody who's going to those. Your info desk is in the virtual world is a chat box or a Q&A box or your email box. So support staff, this is kind of a catch-all, but again, think about where you had volunteers or internal staff that you pulled, from other departments for your physical events. Those people probably will still be needed based on their skill set or their knowledge set, and you'll want to place them in the right places. So I would, as you're starting out planning your virtual event, obviously get your agenda in place, and then from there you'll be able to see kind of all the areas you'll need help. You'll need, speaker managers, you'll need people on the phone calling, your speakers to make sure they're ready to go still and their internet's working, all that good stuff. So
Thank you, Grace. And that kind of gets into actually our planning timeline and content strategy. So we've broken it out here to different size events because obviously depending on the size of your event, the more work it's going to be. Depending on how much content you have for your virtual event, the more work it could be. So you always want to have enough planning time dedicated to the event. We recommend typically for smaller sized events, which is anywhere up to 100 participants is what we would consider on the small side, 2 to 3 months, and that's about 3 to 5 hours of content. For medium-sized events, 3 to 4 months, that could be anywhere from 101 to 500 participants. That's like a multi-day conference, 1 to 2 days of content. That could be full days, it could be half days. It would be a little bit of a mix, even if you have some kind of on-demand, but still the amount of content is the same, depending on the platform you choose to kind of, or the channel you choose to put that out on. But I would have definitely allow 3 to 4 months planning time for that type of size event. And larger events, you would need much more planning time, 4 to 6 months. This is anywhere from 500 participants or more. worth about 3 to 5 days of content, which, as you can imagine, is a lot of content. So, Grace, did you have anything that you wanted to add to those?
Yeah, only that I think, sometimes, Raina and I have talked about this a lot offline. Just there are so many factors that go into place of how much time you need, and lots of you might be getting requested to do a virtual event for 500 people, and you've only got 2 months. So again, I hope this webinar, and if not, we can help in the Q&A or afterwards, but enables you to build out a timeline so that you can go to your stakeholders and say, this is why I need the support, this is why I need this much time. Often the people who are asking us to plan these events may not have thought through that content strategy that Raina was talking about. So to come up with 3 to 5 days of content takes a lot of time, and typically may or may not be your role, depending on who you are that's called in, but it could be multiple stakeholders within your company have that knowledge in their heads, and they need to pull that out. Just like a physical event, you've got a content lead or multiple content leads. So just thinking about that. And then also your marketing, if you're having an internal versus an external event, which we're going to talk about marketing here in a minute, but thinking about how far out you need to start emailing and inviting people in order to get that attendance that you need.
Yeah, and I like to make a note on that too. That's a good point. So it does go hand in hand with your marketing timeline. When you have content ready, or at least when you have a brief program and speaker list ready to announce to your virtual event, which is going to draw your attendance. Typically, if it's a larger size event that you have a shorter planning timeline than we recommend here, which is 4 to 6 months, you're going to be rushing to confirm speakers, get all of their information, biographies, headshots, put it together in a program, and then announce it to your audience. So you want to have enough lead time to be able to do that. And this also kind of, I think people forget in the planning timeline, this accounts for approval processes, having decision makers involved, scheduling speakers to get that content ready for them. And in a virtual format, with technology, in some cases, if you're doing a pre-recorded, you have to go back and do re-records and do editing and do taping. So there's a lot of buffer in here for those kind of things. And that's why we recommend allowing this much lead time to plan and execute a successful event. It's not a hard number, as Grace mentioned. There are a lot of variables that go into a virtual event, but we're recommending a planning timeline with your content strategy based on the size of your event. This is a good starting point. And that takes us into budgeting. So budgeting is a big question when it comes to virtual events. I like to break it down into kind of 5 sequences, if you will, or categories within the virtual event process. And that is your planning, which is the first piece, of course. And under that is content and technical strategy. So when the planning phase of a virtual event is going to have all of that built in there, like we just talked about. Your agenda, you may not have a formalized rhythm show yet, but it's the strategy that's going to be your foundation and your building platform for the rest of these other pieces within the virtual event process. So the design, I'd say, and I'll have Grace add to this a little more, is kind of I'd say on the tech side. It's what you're actually designing your digital event experience to be. The look of it, the branding, marketing kind of goes in there as well. And then production and logistics, that's your platform. If you have a studio, some virtual events, you actually, you have kind of your front of house headquarters where your team is there day of on site, and marketing graphic design pieces also fall into that production phase. Your on-site phase, rehearsals, live event days, and post-event. I want to kind of call out post-event because in some cases, and I think some of us are guilty of this, even with live physical events, when an event is over, we feel like it's over. That's it, the event's done. And it's not done. There's a lot of follow-up after that needs to take place, and not just promoting your next event, but follow-up communications with your sponsors, your attendees, reporting, analytics, etc. So, Grace, would you like to add to these different phases in the process?
Yeah, for sure. So I know we've got another slide here, which is we're gonna get into a little bit more numbers. So I know lots of you guys are probably like, how much does this cost? Give me, I know that's the question I get most often. So we are gonna give you some really rough numbers just as guidelines. But I want to loop back to that on-demand piece because the marketer in me is very passionate about that. So post-event, what Raina started to talk about, the benefit and the value, one of the value points for having virtual events is that you have highly produced, hopefully, you're doing highly produced, beautiful video and audio content with great visuals. So you've got all of that at your fingertips, and assuming you've got permission from all the right people, you can record that and then share that content out later. So for those of you guys who are marketers or work with your in-house marketing team, this is a great place to collaborate and offer them some really great assets. I think we might get into this a little bit in more detail later, but I'll just touch on it. Now, you can slice and dice the videos. You can call out snippets, of key points that your speakers made. You can use those on social and email marketing campaigns. Sales folks or customer success types of folks, account manager folks can send those, quotes and nuggets to people directly. Somebody, if you've got a content marketing person on your team, somebody to write blog recaps or white papers, one pagers, whatever your organization or association calls those items, there's great ways to use those videos and create other types of content that can be used in email nurture streams, social media, direct outreach by your account managers, etc. And then also reporting and analyzing the data and how your folks engaged with you. So unlike face-to-face events, often it was very hard to know. I mean, you might have had badge scanners and known how many people were going into each breakout session or going into your keynotes, but it's even easier with the right virtual event platform. It's even easier to find out what content was most interesting, what speakers were most interesting, and how long people stayed engaged. Also with those chats and polls that we talked about, you can grab data, throughout the event if you see the opportunity. So yeah, all of this stuff are benefits, and we just want to make sure you're building into your timeline and budget and working with your marketing team that after you put all this, blood, sweat, and tears into creating the content, that a marketing team or somebody is taking that and coming up with a post-event plan to use it for long into the future. Like this stuff should last you 6 months.
Right, and that's definitely important to note, to repurpose content that you already have. So you're not necessarily just building it for your virtual event. You, in the planning phase, like we're talking about content and technical strategies, you would talk about that and how the content you're creating and curating now you can use later. And the reason we kind of broke it up into these different phases under budgeting is because this is what you're paying for, right? These are the different processes that go into it. And so now that we kind of move into numbers a little bit, these are not hard numbers. It's definitely a starting point. They can vary greatly. However, since we were talking about different sizes on events, small, medium, and large, this is what you should kind of expect now that we've reviewed your team roles, what you need to fill for that, and the different sequences within the virtual event process as far as numbers in order to budget for a virtual event. So on the smaller side, if you're not necessarily looking for heavy detailed analytics and data and your event is small, again, remembers up to 100 attendees, we would kind of ballpark that anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000. And that is with a very simple virtual events platform, which we'll kind of get into in the resources a little bit. There's a lot of tech out there to choose from, but not necessarily having very detailed analytics with that. It can give you, attendance rates and login times and things like that. With the 20,000 to 49,000 range, that would be more medium-sized events, and that's a bigger range. If you recall, the medium-sized event is about 101 to 500 people. So that's kind of why that range is so large there. And this is a good fit for an event if you had it previously in person, for example, an annual conference, which most associations have. If you're looking to move that to a virtual platform, you would kind of fall under this range, and you're capturing and using much more detailed event data because the platform is going to be a little bit more higher level and that you're budgeting for. So with large size events, higher number, obviously, this is the 500 plus size event. It could be anywhere from a minimum of 50,000 or more. And this kind of type of event, I'd say, is known for, you're known for the content. It's been a long-standing event. It's relevant to even a broader audience. Maybe travel restrictions were, or limiting people coming to your previous in-person event, but you can actually reach more people on virtual, and you have the budget that you've set to invest in a larger size virtual event. This would be kind of that range. So Grace, do you have anything to touch on with these numbers that we have?
Yeah, I can just add some color here around what is making up this money. And so some of your biggest costs are AV, audio and visual equipment, production, your production team who runs the AV equipment, and then of course your virtual event platform. To Raina's point, your cost goes up the more robust your virtual event platform is, and those can be for a low end virtual event platform, you might spend $5,000, but easily you get into the 25K, 50K, 100K, even just for your virtual event platform, especially if you want to retain that platform for a couple of months afterwards to use as your on-demand resource for the content. Sometimes you can pull that content off and then put it on your own company website or on a separate event page that maybe you own through WordPress or what have you. But if you don't have that or the capability to set that up, then you might be relying on the virtual event platform, and then you're paying for it, for several months afterwards. Also with virtual event platforms, sometimes there's a flat fee, but most of the time I have found that it is a reoccurring monthly fee or an annual commitment even. The other option is, if you don't go with a virtual event platform, is that you've got, web developers and folks in-house or a team that you can hire that will build you a custom event page where all of your content can live, and they know how to embed video content and all that good stuff. So you can absolutely custom create, your own virtual experience without a platform. You're not going to have a lot of the bells and whistles unless you have really technically savvy people, which most people are not going to have. But if you didn't want all the bells and whistles of a virtual platform, you could build your own landing page and embed video in there. So then going to AV and production and those costs. One thing to keep in mind is that I know a lot of people right now I'm talking to are thinking about hybrid events, and it's exciting to think that we are going to ease back into face-to-face, but when from a budget perspective, it's almost double the cost. In some cases, it is double the cost to have a virtual event. To have a hybrid event. You are hosting two events at that point. So let's say you're going to do a hybrid event for 100 people. You're expecting 50 people in the room, socially distanced, what have you, and then you're hoping for maybe 50 or more, who knows, virtually. You need two production crews managing the experience for both people. You can't just plop a camera down in front of the stage in your in-person venue and then hook in a feed and stream that out over Zoom. You could, but it's not going to be a great experience, and your virtual audience is not going to get the value and might not even hang out and watch the rest of it. You certainly don't want to charge for an experience like that. You also want to think about having two MCs, again, two different experiences. You'll want to think about how you lay out your content for that hybrid event. If there's breaks, if there's different entertainments, video editing, that kind of stuff. So that's just a note on a hybrid. Happy to answer more questions live about that if any of you guys are thinking about hybrid. But going back to production and AV, so the equipment, lots of you guys could probably do some basic virtual events just on Zoom. But the minute you get into multiple speakers or having a presentation and a speaker, having breakout rooms, having tracks, like different tracks happening at one time of content, you really need to bring in AV or technical help, even if you are going to use Zoom. Like having switchers, audio and video switchers are so key to making those experiences more seamless for your virtual audience. Those things just cost money, and setups and equipment and things that you probably don't want to invest learning how to use, or maybe you do. And then from a video editing perspective, even if you're 100% virtual, you want somebody who's got video editing and graphics and animation experience who can put in welcome, slides and videos and animation, graphic animation. You want it to really make your virtual event come to life. You don't just want a PowerPoint deck that you are sliding through for multiple hours on end. So a video editor is key. They can also do things like put the name and company name and the speaker's name at the bottom of the slides. They can do graphics if you've got like a visual theme, which I recommend for your virtual event. They can do overlays on your videos, all kinds of cool stuff like that that will make your event look more polished, more professional. And again, especially if you're going to be charging money, you don't want to skip out on those things because people are on Zoom all day and they're probably watching a bunch of webinars too when they can in the background. So you really need to stand out if you're going to invest any of these, budget tiers. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer more questions about money because I know that's a hot topic for people.
Thank you, Grace. I had a couple of notes on some items that you were mentioning. So with AV and tech and the cost with that, there are also some platforms that charge a per participant rate.
That's a good point.
So you, in the consultation process and when you're sourcing for AV platform and you're getting quotes from them, you're going to want to work with your planning team on really kind of a good estimated number of what you expect your attendance to be for your conference, because they will charge based on that amount. So if you say, 200 and it ends up being 400, your cost is going to go up. So during the planning phase, of course, that is something that you can estimate and working with your team on that. So I just wanted to note that different pricing structures for different platforms. And then same thing like Grace was mentioning about video editing. Again, it comes down to the quality of the virtual event that you're offering, which is why these numbers can fluctuate so much, because as we mentioned in the previous slide, the digital event experience is a big budget item. And what you add to that and the value you add to that for your attendees, it's going to cost money. So that's why kind of these numbers fluctuate. But I think we covered most of it there. We are happy to answer any questions live, as she mentioned, but we'll move forward here on the next topic. So how to attract attendees. Again, obviously, very important. You want people to come to your event. There are pre-event and post-event phases for this. So I'm going to go ahead and let Grace talk about the pre-event marketing strategies.
Awesome. So again, internal versus external meetings or virtual conferences, yeah, you want to keep that in mind. But let's assume that your event is external and you need to drive registrations, you need to drive brand awareness around this event. Even if it's an event that happens every year, maybe it's an annual membership event, you still need to attract those people and show value. And let's also assume that you're charging for most tickets. You might have tiered tickets, just like you would for your face-to-face event. I know we're not going, we don't have like a full slide on registration tactics, but I'll touch on it a little bit here. Just like you'd have tiered registration and ticketing pricing for your face-to-face event, you'll want to think what that looks like for your virtual event. As far as pricing, I would recommend evaluating the content and the value that you are confident you'll be able to give in your virtual event, and then pricing accordingly. I would not recommend just charging what you charged for the physical experience. Some things to keep in mind are, did you provide meals, at your face-to-face event that you're not able to obviously replicate? I mean, you might be able to through like mailing treats and so forth, but probably not at the same quality or same level. So think about what value is not able to be replaced, and then charge an appropriate price. You might even want to do a little focus group. If it's a membership meeting, you might have a smaller membership base that you could do a little focus group around and see what they might pay for if you've provided them a sample agenda. So that's a little note about registration. But as from a marketing and email standpoint, I would recommend, if you're doing a multi-day conference, not starting, starting your marketing outreach at least 3 months in advance. If you only have like a day's worth of content, then you might be able to start it a little bit later, maybe 6 weeks. If you have a webinar, generally 2 to 4 weeks. So kind of back it out like that. But if you've got a multi-day conference, definitely try to start 3 months out, even if that's a save the date. that's going out the first time, and then invites after that. I always map out my marketing calendars. I just take a screenshot of the calendar and then back out my weeks across that, so that I know how much time I have to meet my registration goals. That's kind of another tip. If you don't do this for your face-to-face events, maybe a good time to start doing it for your virtual events, is backing out registration goals, especially if you've got a team that's helping you drive those registrations. So that every 2 weeks you have another milestone within your registration goals that you've met. Otherwise, you kind of get to the end point and you're like, crap, I'm way behind. So I'd set those little milestones, and then I'd align your emails and your invite strategy against those. In my experience, and y'all will know better within your associations what your open rate is on marketing emails. But typically I've seen about 20%. I think that's the industry standard. So just by sending a marketing invite out, not everybody knows about your event. So it's really going to be reliant on your member facing, your customer facing, your prospect facing, whoever your audience is, whoever is the person that is their contact or their representative from your company needs to be also emailing them. In the marketing tech world, we call this, sales enablement, but you need to enable your team. You need to give them email copy, social copy, talking points copy, anything like that, where they can then do that direct outreach. People are more likely to respond to human connection. Just kind of, we all know that, but I think sometimes as marketers and as event planners, we forget that piece of it because we, get busy planning in our tunnel. Bring in your executives, bring in your sponsors, bring in your partners, and give them calls to action on how they can help you drive registration. Let's see. As far as like member incentives and discounts, you guys will be able to figure out, again, with your pricing structure, what is the most appropriate. But certainly having a virtual event allows you to open up your content and your experience to a bigger audience. So if you've only done a member event in the past, like a members only event, but maybe you're trying to drive new membership, or maybe this is an opportunity for you to drive new members, think about what that content might be for them. Is it a separate track? Is it an extra day? Like, how can you gain more value for your association, organization, or company because you have this virtual platform now? It doesn't require travel, doesn't require people committing to being away from the office or their home, etc. So this might be a new membership driving tactic for you. So think about different pricing to incentivize different audiences. And then post-event, we talked a little bit about this, but something in particular that I wanted to mention was, how do you monetize the content? So not just from a marketing perspective and educating and providing thought leadership and maybe even driving some new membership out of that content post-event, but how do you actually drive revenue for your association, organization, or company? Can you bundle? Like, are you an association that offers CE credits? Can you bundle that content and sell it on an on-demand page if they weren't able to attend the event? Could you bundle event registration ticket price plus the on-demand video? Maybe not everybody gets the on-demand video. What is the value of that to your audience? I've heard some excellent case studies around this, that associations, have been doing virtual events, I think much longer, at least a handful of them have been doing it much longer than rest of the world, and have found great revenue results from it. So you're providing great value. What could be the financial return for you on that, and how might you structure your content for different audiences, both members and then future members?
Thank you, Grace. Yep, those are all great points. And just a couple of things I wanted to point out, as you mentioned, the member incentives and discounts. So when we're talking about pricing and working with you on the planning phase, pricing is going to be a big thing. Obviously, the attendees always want to know, once you start pushing out those emails, what the cost of the event is going to be for them. And so offering member pricing, student pricing, if you have specific roles in your association where you can offer discounted pricing for members, and then non-member pricing is typically a little bit higher to get them to hopefully become members and get that discount, but of course for other reasons to become members of your association. So that's a little bit of the kind of incentives there. and you can do that with early bird pricing. You can have member early bird pricing, non-member early bird pricing also. So that's something that we would work on during the planning phase, and just as far as registration tactics. And within that incentive too, you can kind of work with the on-demand content. So we put on-demand content under post-event. Sometimes, in some cases, we can do that pre-event, which essentially we would push out on-demand videos to people who have registered for the event about a week before they're joining, live on the day of the virtual multi-day conference. So if you have a part 1 or part 2 type of series or presentation, they can watch that beforehand. It's almost like a little bit of a hype video for the on-demand content. And then that even incentivizes them more to join definitely for the live portions of that multi-day conference. So if your conference is, say, 2 days in August, a week before that, you're pushing out these on-demand videos to people who have signed up. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. And definitely continuing education is a big piece, I know, for associations. So you already kind of have that draw if you have a requirement for your audience to get continuing education, whether it's for their licensing or different certifications that they have to meet every year to renew their memberships. You want to take that into account during the planning phase, how many continuing education credits you can offer for your event that is going to draw that attendance. And that kind of goes hand in hand with engaging attendees. So during your event, and we kind of throw the verbiage around of live. So live would be like right now, right? You're watching live. So when we're talking live virtual event, like live on TV. During your event live, you can do polls and surveys. You can schedule these in advance. It's not something that you necessarily have to have someone right there typing all the survey questions out in the polls and pushing that out to your audience. With event platforms, you can schedule these, prep your questions in advance, drop them into your platform, and as someone is presenting, or even during a transition between presenters, you can have polls and surveys with questions relevant to that topic that they just discussed for the audience to engage with each other and answer these polls, vote on something, answer these questions. Ask more questions in the chat and the Q&A as well. They can have these topical conversations between each other in the chat features of a virtual event platform to get kind of that networking aspect and engage with each other. And then live answered questions by the speakers in the Q&A, similar to what we're going to be doing here soon. So these are pretty common. You may have heard already: polls, surveys, chats, Q&A. Even with the simplest virtual event platforms, those are available. But we find that a lot of people don't really use them too much. So it is definitely an option there to even promote more networking with your audience members and attendees, and scheduling those in advance. So gamification is one that we wanted to talk about more as an opportunity for virtual events, especially in the association space, because gamification is, I wouldn't say too common necessarily with association events, but it's definitely a big opportunity. And there's a lot of data around gamification. It's essentially, where you're drawing and engaging your attendees to participate in something other than just viewing the presentations. So offering door prizes or digital gifts, rewards points is something that we've seen done before. And you can come up with those again during the planning phase. So maybe it's a discounted membership, or it's a registration to a future conference, different prizes. There's a little bit of rules around calling it raffles, depending on what association kind of industry you are. So you just have to be careful with the language around it. But digital gifts, store prizes, rewards points. There are many different things that you can use to engage your attendees, and it may not be something that they're expecting during the live event. So Grace, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, something I've seen done pretty successfully is also having using Slack for virtual events. People were experimenting with this with face-to-face events before pre-pandemic, but I've seen great success with using Slack channels for virtual events. You can name to create engagement specifically, so you can create different breakout rooms, so to speak, or different channels on the Slack group that you started that's only accessible to your event attendees, of course. But you could have sponsors in there. You could have thought leaders from inside your own company. You could have different networking topics. People want to meet on certain things. I would just recommend kind of going back to that community moderator, community management type of role we talked about earlier in the presentation. Making sure that you've got people in each of those channels within your Slack group, moderating the conversation and making sure people get their questions asked, making sure that if there's any follow-up, especially with any important, folks that are attending, that they get the, white glove service. So I like that as an option, and it's something that will work for you pre-event and post-event. As long as you have the Slack group open, people can continue to network in there before, during, and after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something we've seen done before too, just essentially like online forums that are a part of the virtual event space. So if you have, people signing up for your event, they get this opportunity to be a part of this forum to continue conversations with not just speakers and sponsors or exhibitors who are part of the event, but other registrants also and attendees pre and post event, like she mentioned. So just something to definitely consider as far as the survey usage and chat and Q&A and gamification during your planning process. And so we have a couple of resources as well to mention. I'm going to go ahead and let Grace cover the first two, and I will cover the next two.
Yeah, I know we've thrown a lot at you in the past 45 minutes, and we're about to open up to live Q&A. We can't wait to hear your questions. Nothing is off the table for us. But one of the best places I go when I'm looking for ideas or ways to innovate around virtual events or even physical events, but are these two sources, the Vendry and also BizBash. Both of them have an abundance of virtual event information. They've spent the past year, collecting it, of course. So if you're looking for a mixologist, or you're looking for a professional MC, or if you're looking for some more information about how to plan virtual events, both of these places would be a good place to go start and maybe get some inspiration, take some screenshots. If you are going to work with a professional planner or hire an agency, they of course can cull down that list to make it a little bit more manageable, which is the benefit of working with a third-party provider. But if you are totally grassroots on your own, can't afford any help, then these lists, although overwhelming, do provide a lot of information that you can go through yourself.
Yeah, and then just to add to those, aside from searching for vendors and inspiration on your virtual events and getting more of guidelines, kind of like we've discussed today, there's the tech side. So Personify is one that is specific for associations. So some of you may be familiar with Personify already if you use their software. They have recently developed software specific to virtual events, which is new. But it's just one of the many virtual event platforms out there that I would recommend visiting, not just on the virtual event side, but their blog has a lot of resources in general for associations. So statistics in planning events, what associations and nonprofits are doing transitioning to virtual or hybrid nowadays, and then of course more specifics on their software. But definitely their blog has a lot of resources and videos and even on-demand webinars that you can view. And of course, Stansfeld also, we have a blog on our website, stansfeldllc.com, where we have a series of blogs covering virtual events. So if you're looking for more resources, definitely after this webinar, please visit our website and look into those blogs for more information. And I think we're ready to open it up to questions.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear what kind of questions we've got.
Well, thank you, ladies, Grace and Raina, for such an informative presentation. As promised, we're going to go ahead and move over to our Q&A and use the last few minutes of our time to ask some of those. So the first portion of questions are in terms of cost and revenue. So in terms of revenue, would I be better off postponing my in-person conference or taking it virtual?
You want me to answer that one first?
Yeah, Raina, I'll let you take it since you're the association expert.
Okay, so in terms of revenue, would I be better off postponing my in-person conference or taking it virtual? As we mentioned on that slide before, there's definitely that range for virtual events. But as you can imagine, if you've already been hosting in person, when you have hotel and travel costs and speaker costs and catering and food, all of that adds up to be a lot more than a virtual event. So I would say, you know, in revenue and depending what you're charging your attendees for the event as well, um, taking it virtual is definitely going to be a great option because you can not only monetize on the on-demand content that we discussed after your event, you can do that for in-person too, but your overhead costs are going to be much less than if you were hosting a multi-day event at a hotel, for example. And I'll let Grace expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I've heard mixed results from clients. So I'm mostly in the B2B space versus associations. And even from a revenue perspective in the B2B space, it's mixed results. You really have to think about your audience. If your audience is technically savvy, maybe they're a little bit more introverts, then virtual events could be perfect for them, and they may not want to go back to a face-to-face event. But if your face-to-face event or if what you're trying to create or recreate required a lot of networking, a lot of relationships, a lot of people who benefited from meeting with those groups of people, and they only did it at your event one time a year, it's hard to replicate that. Networking and relationship building is one of the hardest things to replicate in the virtual event world. There are lots of platforms that are doing the best they can at trying to do that with Zoom meetings. You can book one-on-one matchmaking and Zoom meetings and things like that. But so I would just take that in mind. I don't know that some companies are able to get away with charging a similar price or a higher price for their virtual events, but they're also able to then budget in really high production quality. So they're hiring major video production companies, very robust virtual event platforms. Plus, they're still probably spending or are spending money on their celebrity keynote speakers. The Bill Gates and those people are still on the speaking circuit market. So if you can afford them and you were paying for them before, those speakers might be a little less expensive. They probably are a little bit less expensive in the virtual world. At least a lot of them are. I won't speak for all of them, but a lot of them are, since they don't have to travel. Although your cost might come down a little bit, it's not going to offset. There's not a whole lot of savings in that regard. Raina's definitely right. You're not paying for venue or food, but if you've got these other bells and whistles you're trying to bring into the virtual world, it's still going to cost you. So I think all that to say, you really need to evaluate your audience. Are they going to, wrap their arms and get involved in a digital event? How long can you hold their attention for? If your face-to-face conference was, typically 3 days, maybe you go down to a day and a half and just make it really, really cool content. And you spend a lot of money on a day and a half versus spending double the money or potentially more money on a 3-day event, like you did in the real-time world. So, and then I get honest about the value you're providing, like I mentioned earlier, and what financially your industry can handle, especially during kind of the past year and a half of challenges everyone's had. So, and one other thing I'll just throw out there is I have had lots of clients and worked with lots of teams who they may have had a full physical conference that they've canceled or postponed and all those things. The other option is not just to go to full-on virtual conference, may not even be go to like a day and a half virtual conference. It could be that you start investing more into your webinar or digital event series types of events. You can do a lot with webinar platforms. We haven't talked a lot about platforms in this presentation, but webinar platforms are pretty inexpensive. Most of you might already have them. Think about what type of content that you can put out, on those, and what can, from this session and other things you've read, like what can you pull as inspiration from virtual events and infuse that into your webinars, so that, because you're competing against a lot of webinars in the market right now. So how can you make your webinars better than everyone else's in your industry, and squeeze as much juice and goodness out of those, versus thinking the only other option is spend $50,000 on a virtual event.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that too. So when Grace is mentioning webinar platform and earlier we said virtual event platform, in some cases it is two different things. Some platforms will have the capability for both, right? But there are much kind of higher level production, more robust platforms out there than just a webinar platform or just a meeting platform, which is totally different. But that is an option as well. So as we kind of mentioned in the very beginning, the difference between webinars and conferences, with webinars, we have had in some cases clients who actually move to a quarterly webinar basis or even more than quarterly versus, because they had to cancel their in-person annual conference versus just trying to rush to get that to put together onto a virtual. It just wasn't the best fit for them. And some events may not be a fit for the virtual space in that case. And that's when webinars can come into play. So again, that's when you really want to discuss with your planning team and review statistics and review your pricing. Can you charge, the amount that you want to and still make revenue off of moving to a virtual platform? Or maybe it's all going to be about timing as well, just because this past year there's been so much uncertainty in certain areas. Some places are open for events, some are not, some you can do hybrid, some you can't. So you really want to evaluate all of those variables when looking to postpone your event.
Thank you so much, ladies. So question 2 and 3 actually kind of go hand in hand with one another. So is the overall cost typically a flat rate no matter how many attendees there end up being? And then part 2, if a medium event is held, will the cost be the same whether it's 101 or 499 people attending?
No, so I can answer that. When we were kind of discussing the budget slide, we gave a range there. So there's not necessarily flat rate costs. There are too many variables to come up with a flat rate. But I believe on the medium size event, we said anywhere between $20,000 to $49,000. Large size, you're looking at $50,000 and more as far as costs go. So yeah, if it's, again, with the variables, I'd say if you're at 101, you may be on the lower end, but you could be at 101 and shift your line items around and really invest in some high quality video and get up to that $50,000 range. It depends where you're putting that expense and that cost in your line items for your budget. The more people you have, and the more, just like in an in-person event, the more people you have, the more expensive it is. And the more people you have, the more content you're going to want to push out, also high quality content for your audience. So that range is there as a guide, but I definitely wouldn't say that there's necessarily a flat rate for that. Did I answer both of those questions, Ari?
Yes, thank you so much. So in terms of, you had mentioned and you were talking about just AV and video individuals. So as a beginner, where would one start their search, and what are some of the things that maybe they should be looking for in the quote unquote right AV company or right AV person?
Grace, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. So I would, if you're new at planning events fully, or if you're new at virtual events, either way, I would definitely seek out an event planning resource like Stansfeld or someone else, because there are AV companies are typically just focused on their piece of it, and there's so many other elements, as we've discussed, that kind of go into it. They're gonna have a lot of questions for you. And so putting together your RFP is like number one thing, even before you do any outreach. You need to know, how many days of content, how many hours of content, roughly, at least a good range you're going to have, how many speakers, what type of, it's good to have an internal idea of what your budget is from your stakeholders and your executives, because, if you only have $10,000, you're probably not going to be outsourcing a lot of things, and you're going to need to hire like a contractor and find a really good production or tech contractor of some sort to help fill in there. You're probably not going to be able to afford an agency, a production agency, depending on the city you're in and your connections. So I think that's probably a good place to start, is just getting realistic about your budget internally, even if you're not willing to say that out loud to anybody yet, and then putting your RFP together. People like Raina can help you put together an RFP template. That's another good reason that third parties are helpful in this case, because they'll prepare you for those conversations and start setting your expectations. And also, I would make sure, if you do want to go straight to the AV production company on your own, I would just Google, virtual event production and start looking at their websites. And if you understand what they're selling to you, that's probably a good place to start. A lot of them, talk tech terms. And if you're not going to have a third party planner, you're going to get lost along the way, and not have like a translator, so to speak. So that would be my pro tip if you're going to go it without a third party planner.
And I'll just add to that real briefly, because I know we're coming up on time here, but we did mention the Vendry also as a vendor marketplace resource. Looking to the event industry website themselves actually are really great resources. So obviously, if you're not familiar with the event industry itself, BizBash, the Vendry, those are websites that are continuously pumping out content for event professionals, and that's a good place to start. Also, with putting together your RFP, I noticed sometimes people do it backwards, and it's not necessarily wrong, but they just don't know what their content's going to be. They don't know what their agenda is going to be, right? You're kind of starting off, and where do you start? Where do you begin? And when you go to a tech team, like Grace said, they're going to have all these questions for you. So if you have an idea, at least, and you're building that from the forefront, this is kind of the timeline that I want to have together. This is the amount of content that I want to have. This is what I'm thinking the virtual event space is going to look like. Then taking that to an AV production team or planning team to help you even build it more is definitely going to be helpful, because that process alone, the RFP process and curating, getting quotes from outside vendors and comparing them, and then budgeting is a long process in and of itself. So if you've already kind of gotten started with your major pieces, that would definitely help you in the long run.
And I will just add one more thing. I know we're over time and we're about to end, but the number one question any third party event planning or production company hopefully is going to ask you are, what are your goals? So if you and your stakeholders are not clear on what your goals are for the virtual event, it's going to be a tough conversation. So get clear about your goals, and then all those other things me and Raina just mentioned about, like agenda, the amount of content, that kind of thing. But goals will be first, because a good partner will help you meet those goals and won't just worry about logistics. They'll be strategic partners.
Thank you again, Grace and Raina. As mentioned, that's all the questions that we have time for today. But don't forget, we're going to be posting a blog on our website with all the answers to the questions that we covered today here, as well as the ones that we did not have time to get today. So thank you again for joining us today. If you have questions about this webinar or how Stansfeld can help grow your organization, please feel free to reach out to info@stansfeldllc.com. Also, be on the lookout for our next webinar that will be taking place in May, where we will be discussing blogging for Associations 101. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.